The gatekeeper was fined by the HOA for growing vegetables in his backyard. Then a botanist walked in and silenced the courtroom. They didn't care that he kept the place clean. They only cared that his tomatoes had roots where they didn't want color to grow. Malcolm Reed had worked the front gate of the Crestfall Meadows community for 11 years without a single complaint, not one. He knew every face, every car, every passcode. Kids waved to him on scooters. Retirees greeted him like he was furniture, but at least polite furniture. He wasn't expecting a letter, not a fine, and especially not one laced in veiled language and regulation codes so old they cough dust. Violation: unauthorized agricultural use of private property. That's what the paper said, typed in Times New Roman like an insult on official letterhead. He looked up from the letter at his backyard. The peppers were coming in well this year. Cherry tomatoes were ripening in the morning sun. The collard greens, his mother's legacy, stood proudly like flags in a war he hadn't chosen to fight. The letter had been hand-delivered, of course. That was their style. Not a knock, just the subtle clap of paper between door and frame. Malcolm recognized the HOA's seal before he even picked it up. A laurel wreath over a house piece by Control. He wasn't angry, not at first, just confused, then tired. It wasn't the vegetables. He knew that. His next-door neighbor had potted citrus trees. Another family had a full herb wall. But they weren't like him. They had manicured lawns, sun hats, wine nights. He had soil under his nails and worn boots from his second job. And his skin didn't match the Homeowners Association's brochure. He folded the letter and slid it into the back pocket of his uniform. Another shift at the gate loomed, and he didn't want to carry bitterness into work. The gate didn't care about race. But people did. People smiled with their teeth but not their eyes. That night, he watered the garden longer than usual. By Friday, he had 10 days to cease agricultural activities or face legal action, whatever that meant. The fine was laughable in amount $250, but Malcolm knew it wasn't about the money. It was a warning. It was a gate being closed. He thought about taking the plants out, letting the earth go bare. Maybe he could replace it with some store-bought turf, something HOA-friendly, something that wouldn't raise flags. But then he thought of his mother's hands, scarred from years of picking, still moving gracefully in the soil even when her knees no longer let her bend. He thought of the first sprig of rosemary he'd grown from seed, of how his small garden fed the older woman next door, the single mother 3 houses down, the mailman who liked collards. He thought of what it meant to grow something where others only saw weeds. So he stayed quiet, and he kept watering. The HOA doubled down. This time, a formal complaint was filed with the district magistrate. Malcolm was summoned to court. It was surreal, the idea that a man could be dragged into court for feeding himself from the ground he paid taxes on. But here he was, seated in a municipal courtroom that smelled like laminate and dried coffee. He wore his best shirt, collar ironed, shoes shined. No tie. He refused to choke on dignity. The judge was white. The HOA representative was white. Even the clerk's nameplate looked like it came from a different world. And there was Malcolm, brown skin in a beige world. They called it a zoning violation, repeated non-compliance. They quoted page numbers, bylaws, homeownership clauses. The HOA lawyer, a thin man with a voice like glass, spoke of property values and aesthetic uniformity. The word blight came up like his garden was a disease. Malcolm wanted to speak, not shout, just speak. But his words were trapped beneath layers of protocol. Then the door creaked. Every head turned. She walked in like silence had weight. A tall black woman in a fitted blazer and low heels, holding a canvas bag and something else, something invisible but unmistakable. Command. The judge blinked. The HOA lawyer paused. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I was told this was the case involving Mr. Reed's garden." The judge nodded warily. "And you are Dr. Renee Whitfield, Professor of Environmental Science and Urban Botany, Howard University, and an expert witness on the value of regenerative community agriculture." Her words didn't land. They detonated. The HOA lawyer looked as though someone had replaced his script with Braille. The judge leaned back slightly, unsure whether to object or be impressed. Malcolm just stared. He had never seen this woman before in his life. Dr. Whitfield took the stand with a quiet grace. She unpacked 3 things from her bag: a photo of Malcolm's garden, a peer-reviewed article about soil revitalization, and a single perfect tomato in a clear case. "This," she began, holding up the tomato like a lawyer might hold evidence, "is not just produce, it's protest, it's nourishment, it's heritage." The courtroom didn't breathe. She went on about how marginalized communities had historically used backyard gardening as a tool of survival and resistance, about how food deserts weren't a myth but a systemic wound, about how Malcolm's garden didn't diminish property values, it enhanced them by promoting sustainability. "He grows food where others pave driveways. That is not a violation. That is vision." The judge cleared his throat. "Dr. Whitfield, do you have any formal relation to Mr. Reed?" "No, Your Honor. Not yet. But people like Mr. Reed are why I teach." She turned to Malcolm and smiled, the kind of smile that feels like shade on a hot day. Court was adjourned pending review. But the silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was transformation. Outside the courtroom, Malcolm finally asked her, "Why'd you do that?" Dr. Whitfield shrugged. "Because you reminded me of my father. He grew okra in a patch behind a laundromat. HOA tried to stop him too. And," she grinned, "they didn't." Malcolm didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, its blades slicing through the dark like the days had been slicing through him. Dr. Renee Whitfield's voice echoed in his head, calm, firm, brilliant. She had spoken truth to power with the kind of grace he had never seen up close. Why had she come? She didn't know him, no family ties, no neighborhood connection. Yet she had shown up like a guardian with a PhD. Saturday morning, he woke before the sun. His garden needed tending. The okra pods had popped open like fists unclenching. The mint had started creeping outside the stone border, wild and defiant. As he plucked weeds and rearranged trellises, he noticed a car pulling up to the curb. A silver Prius. New. She stepped out wearing jeans, a white tee, and a straw hat. "You water early," she said, smiling like they were old friends. "I work the late shift," Malcolm replied. "Mornings are all I got." She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers along the basil. "Still growing despite the fight, huh?" she said. He looked at her. "Same could be said about you." She laughed. Not politely, genuinely. They worked in the dirt side by side, passing tools, sharing silence, and then stories. She told him about her father in Alabama, how he planted marigolds between his collards to keep the pests out. How she studied plants not just for science but for survival. He told her about Crestfall Meadows. How he got the gate job to pay for his mother's medicine. How he'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but life, like soil, didn't always follow the map. Around noon, she wiped sweat from her brow. "They're going to fight harder now. HOA boards don't like to lose." Malcolm nodded. "I've seen how they look at me, like I forgot my place." Renee met his eyes. "Maybe it's time we remind them where we belong." 2 weeks passed. The court reconvened. This time it was different. People showed up. Not just lawyers and board members but residents. Some curious, some confused, a few even supportive. An elderly Vietnamese man from 2 blocks over. A young Latina woman who whispered "thank you" when Malcolm passed. Dr. Whitfield returned with documents, maps, and a bound portfolio titled "Food Justice in Suburban Communities. A Case for Equity." The HOA's attorney tried to rattle her. He poked holes, questioned credentials, referenced bylaws with tight precision. But Renee didn't flinch. Every jab she parried with facts. Malcolm was called to speak next. He stepped up to the stand in a clean navy shirt and dark slacks. He held no papers, just his hands rough from soil, honest from labor. "I didn't grow food to make a point," he said. "I did it because I was hungry, because my neighbors were hungry, because the land behind my house had sun, and I had seeds. That's all." The judge watched, unmoving. I've seen people drive past that gate and pretend like we're invisible, Malcolm continued. But when a man plants something real, something that feeds, suddenly they see him. And suddenly, he's a problem. The courtroom was still. I never asked to be a symbol. But if growing tomatoes makes me one, then so be it. I'll wear that like a badge. He stepped down. Renee gave him a quiet nod. That evening, as Malcolm watered his greens under the orange sky, two boys on bicycles stopped by the sidewalk. "Hey, Mr. Reed," one of them called. "Can we help you water sometime?" He smiled. "Sure. You like tomatoes?" "Only when they're not from the store," the younger boy said. "Yours taste better." Malcolm chuckled. "That's because they're grown right, with care, with truth." He gave them each a few cherry tomatoes in their hands. The boys rode off, laughing. The gatekeeper had become the gardener, and the gardener had become something more. The verdict came the next week. The judge ruled in Malcolm's favor. The court found that the HOA's actions disproportionately targeted Mr. Reed, noting inconsistencies in their enforcement and implicit bias in their documentation. But it wasn't a clean win. The judge offered a compromise. Malcolm could keep his garden if he agreed to maintain aesthetic congruency with surrounding properties. Whatever that meant. It wasn't justice, but it was a crack in the wall. Dr. Whitfield walked with Malcolm outside the courthouse. "They gave you the right to grow, but only if you do it pretty," she muttered. "I'll take it," Malcolm said. "For now." She turned to him. "What if it didn't have to stop here?" He raised an eyebrow. "I've got a grant," she continued. "We're starting urban gardens in places they say food can't grow. Rooftops, alleys, parking lots. But I need someone who knows how to work with people. Someone who's lived what I've only studied." "You offering me a job?" "I'm offering you purpose," she said. He looked at his hands, then the sun, then her. "I'll keep my gate job, for now. But yeah, let's grow something bigger." 3 months later, a new garden bloomed behind the community center in Crestfall Meadows. Raised beds, compost bins, kids planting radishes, elders showing how to clip mint without bruising it. Malcolm stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, straw hat on head. He still wore his uniform on weekdays, but on Saturdays he was the soils keeper. The HOA tried once more to push back citing event permits and landscaping restrictions. But this time, the residents pushed back harder. An older white woman from Malcolm Street showed up at the HOA meeting with a tray of collard green wraps and a petition with 87 signatures. "If this is a threat to property values," she declared, "then I'd rather lose the house." The room fell silent. The board backed down. Back in his backyard, Malcolm's garden thrived. A new row of snap peas climbed the wire fence. He carved a small wooden sign for it, "Mama's Corner." One day, as he pulled carrots with dirt-covered gloves, he heard a voice behind him. "You really did it," Renee said. He looked up. She wore a sun hat and held a stack of pamphlets. "We've got 10 more gardens now," she said. "People from the city are asking questions. Even some schools. You started something." "No," he replied. "You walked into that courtroom and lit a match. I just kept it burning." They sat on his back porch, sipping iced tea and watching the bees bounce between flowers. "You know," she said, "my father would have liked you. Wish I'd met him. He was quiet, stubborn. Thought growing food was a way to speak without words." Malcolm nodded. "Then maybe we're still speaking." But the story didn't end there. Because 2 months later, a new HOA president was elected, a younger man, clean-shaven, with an MBA and a clipboard full of ambition. He knocked on Malcolm's door. "We're considering redefining landscaping parameters," he said, "to avoid further confusion." Malcolm studied him. "Redefining or restricting?" "Standardizing," the man said. "Community cohesion is key." Malcolm didn't blink. "Let me save you the meeting." "No." The man shifted. "I hope you're not being defensive. I hope you're not being blind," Malcolm said. "That garden feeds people. You try to shut it down again, I'll bring 100 more into court, and this time we'll bring cameras." The new president left with nothing more than a nod. Renee heard about it the next day. "You didn't just grow vegetables," she said. "You grew a spine in that whole damn neighborhood." Malcolm smiled. "That's what roots do, right? They hold things steady." Autumn crept in slowly, and with it came cooler nights and the sweet tang of ripening persimmons. Malcolm's garden adjusted naturally, as if the earth itself respected the rhythm of his life. The peppers turned deeper in color. The kale curled tighter. And the community center garden became a place where people no longer whispered, they talked, laughed, even argued over compost bins like family. But change didn't stop at soil level. Renee had begun giving lectures across the county, using Crestfall Meadows as a case study for what she called localized resistance agriculture. The term made Malcolm chuckle. It sounded fancy for what he'd always done with a shovel and seed. But he understood now, names matter. Labels change perception. A man growing food in his backyard was a nuisance. A man leading a resistance? Now that got people's attention. One chilly Thursday evening, after his gate shift, Malcolm found a note stuck to his front door. Urgent community notice. HOA emergency session tomorrow at 6 p.m. Mandatory attendance for lot owners. He wasn't a lot owner, just a tenant. The house belonged to his cousin, a long-haul trucker who'd let Malcolm live there for cheap in exchange for keeping it maintained. But still, the language felt like a flare fired into the night. He took the note to Renee. "They're planning something," he said, placing it beside her teacup. She read it twice, then leaned back in her chair. "Emergency sessions don't happen unless someone's scared." "Of what?" She smiled. "Of what they can't control." The meeting room was packed. Folding chairs scraped linoleum floors. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The new HOA president stood at the front, flanked by board members in pressed blazers and forced smiles. Malcolm took a seat near the back. Renee beside him. Other familiar faces filtered in. Miss Lila from the end of the street, Mr. Tran and his teenage son, and even Mrs. Whitaker, the woman who used to pretend not to see him when she walked past the gate. The president tapped the microphone. "We appreciate you all being here on such short notice," he began. "We are proposing a motion to enforce stricter aesthetic compliance in all outdoor residential areas, including backyard visibility zones." There it was, dressed up in policy, but naked in intent. "The rise of non-standard gardens and unauthorized structures," he continued, "has caused some concern among homeowners regarding neighborhood image and property value." Renee whispered, "They still don't know how to say the word black in public." A few residents stirred. Miss Lila raised her hand. "Are you referring to Malcolm's garden?" "We are referring to a pattern," the president said smoothly. "And it's not personal." Another hand went up. Mr. Tran. "So you're saying my trellis is a problem now too?" "We're discussing cohesive visuals," the president replied. Malcolm stood. The room quieted like someone had just broken glass. "I've been here 11 years, he said. "Long before that garden grew. Long before you got elected. You ever ask who else gardens in this neighborhood? You ever check the rules before you came after me?" The president straightened. "This is not an individual issue." "Yes, it is," Malcolm said. "Because I'm the only one who got the fine. I'm the only one who got called to court. And I'm the only one whose tomatoes apparently don't match your idea of beauty." A smattering of applause began from the back. Miss Lila stood too. "I walk past that garden every morning. Smells like my grandma's porch. If that's what you think ruins the neighborhood, maybe you should plant something yourself." The president's voice tightened. "Please, let's maintain order." Renee rose now, calm but electric. "I'd like to submit a proposal," she said. "That gardens intended for food cultivation, maintained within reasonable care and safety standards, be exempt from aesthetic restrictions unless proven to cause direct harm." The board froze. No one had expected a countermotion, least of all one delivered with the authority of a scholar. Someone from the audience shouted, "Seconded," and just like that, the power shifted. Over the next few weeks, ballots were mailed out. Homeowners were asked to vote on Renee's proposal. It was the first time in HOA history that a resident-initiated amendment had made it to referendum. Malcolm didn't get a ballot, he wasn't on the deed. But that didn't stop him. He spent afternoons walking door to door with Renee, knocking on doors, explaining the issue, handing out flyers that read, "Grow together. A garden is not a crime." Most people nodded. Some closed their doors. Others invited them in for sweet tea and stories of family gardens from the old country. It turned out people missed growing things. They missed community. All they needed was permission. Election day came. The vote passed. By 10 votes. And with that, gardens became legal and visible. The following month, Malcolm hosted the neighborhood's first garden exchange day. People brought herbs, seeds, cuttings, and produce. Kids painted pots with their names. An older man gave a workshop on composting with coffee grounds. Even the new HOA president came, red in the face, holding a cucumber like it might bite him. Renee gave a speech under the old oak tree near the sidewalk. "We're not just feeding ourselves," she said. "We're feeding a future that remembers." The crowd applauded. Malcolm stood quietly in the back, hands dirty, heart full. But change draws attention. Local news stations picked up the story. Then regional ones. Then a national gardening magazine featured Malcolm and Renee on their cover, him holding a basket of produce, her holding a spade like a sword. One morning, Malcolm received a letter in the mail. Not from the HOA this time, from the Department of Agriculture. They wanted to talk about community integration models for food equity. He read the letter twice, then again. "Me," he whispered. Later that week, he found himself walking into a conference hall in D.C., Renee at his side, both of them wearing matching green name tags. The room was full of academics, government officials, nonprofit leaders. People shook his hand, quoted his name, asked for advice. He wasn't used to being listened to. When it was time for him to speak, he looked out over the crowd and said, "I'm not a scientist. I'm not a politician. I'm just a man who put seeds in the dirt. But if that's enough to make change, then maybe the ground's been waiting on us this whole time." Thunderous applause. Renee squeezed his arm. "You just made history." He shook his head. "No, we just reminded it who we are." Back in Crestfall Meadows, the seasons turned again. New gardens cropped up behind chain-link fences. Sunflowers nodded on every block. Raised beds bordered driveways like badges of courage. The gatehouse had a pot of rosemary now, gifted by a little girl who said it smelled like her grandma's hair. Malcolm still sat at the gate some nights, but more often now he was in meetings, gardens, schools, teaching, planting, listening. The HOA never tried again. The bylaws stayed changed. And the man they tried to silence with a $250 fine? He'd made the world listen instead. Winter crept in slowly. Frost laced the garden beds like lace on old quilts. The tomatoes were long gone. The collards hung on proud, stubborn like the people who tended them. Malcolm stood by the back fence one morning, his breath turning white in the cold air. A small boy passed on a scooter and waved. "Morning, Mr. Reed. My mom said your soup's the reason she finally eats beets." Malcolm laughed. "Tell her I've got turnips coming next." The boy zipped away. Behind him, the rows of the garden slept, but not in defeat. In waiting, everything about winter was a whisper that the story wasn't over. An invitation came by email this time, from a major university in upstate New York. They were launching a new urban agriculture fellowship named after Renee Whitfield, and they wanted Malcolm to give the opening keynote. He called her as soon as he finished reading. "They're naming it after you?" he asked. She laughed softly. "I tried to decline. They wouldn't hear it." "You deserve it," he said. "You walked into a courtroom and gave a lesson in how to break silence." "So did you," she replied. "You just did it with dirt." He hesitated. "Renee, I don't know if I belong in lecture halls." She paused. "You don't need to belong. You need to be heard." The night before the keynote, Malcolm sat in a quiet hotel room, staring at the snow outside. It was a long way from Crestfall Meadows, from hot pavement and mint leaves. He thought about his mama, who'd never left Georgia, who used to plant onions by the porch so the smell would keep the ants away. He took out a pen and wrote her name at the top of the page. For Loretta May Reed, who taught me what roots mean. The next day, in a room filled with scientists, city planners, and scholars, he stepped up to the microphone. I never went to school for this, he began. But I went through something a school can't teach. I learned how systems can shrink a man until he forgets he can grow anything at all. He spoke for 40 minutes. He told them about Crestfall Meadows, about the fine, the tomatoes, the courtroom, the garden that saved a neighborhood. He ended with this: I was a gatekeeper once, sat in a little booth watching cars go by, wondering what I was guarding. Really, turns out the gate I needed to open wasn't metal. It was in people's heads. And maybe in their hearts too. The standing ovation lasted a full minute. Back home, the garden waited. Spring came early that year like a promise. Renee had begun building a nonprofit called RootShare, connecting underserved neighborhoods with urban farming resources and community training. Malcolm became its founding field director. He went from state to state, sharing stories, teaching soil science, helping kids plant kale in places where gunshots used to echo. But he always came home. Crestfall was more than his origin story. It was his compass. One day in May, Malcolm walked out to find a teenage girl sitting on the curb outside his house. She was sketching. He approached slowly. You all right? She looked up. Her eyes were bright. I'm drawing your garden. For my civics class. We're doing projects about local history. Malcolm blinked. This old patch of dirt counts as history? My teacher says it's the reason our school added a gardening elective, she replied. They even bought raised beds last month. He sat beside her. What's your name? Kayla, she said. I want to be a biologist, like Dr. Whitfield. He smiled. You will be. They sat in silence a while. She shaded the tomato vines. He watched a butterfly land on the mint. Later that evening, Renee called. They want to nominate us for a community leadership award, she said, half amused, half embarrassed. You interested? He shook his head, smiling. I'm not in this for plaques. Me neither, she said. But it's good to be reminded we did something. He looked at his hands. They were older now, worn, but steady. We didn't just do something, he said. We planted a blueprint. That summer, Crestfall Meadows held its first harvest walk. It started as a joke between neighbors walking street to street, sampling produce like a suburban version of a farmer's market. But it became something more. People decorated their fences with sunflowers. Children gave garden tours. One neighbor wrote a poem about collards and read it from their porch. Malcolm wore a straw hat and handed out jars of pickled okra. Someone asked him if he'd ever imagined this. Never, he said, but I always hoped. That same week, a reporter from the New York Times called. She wanted to do a profile. I'm not a celebrity, Malcolm said. But you are a movement, she replied. He gave the interview anyway, sitting on his porch with Renee, surrounded by bees, basil, and a stubborn little rosemary bush that refused to die. The article went viral. And then, one night, years later, long after the garden had become a landmark, and RootShare had spread to over 20 cities, Malcolm stood in his backyard, older, grayer, but still deeply rooted. A plaque had been mounted to the front gate earlier that week. It read, "The Reed Garden established 2025. A seed of resistance. A home for hope." He watched the sunset drape the rows of beans in gold. He could hear music from a neighbor's porch, someone playing guitar. Laughter floated on the wind. He wasn't a gatekeeper anymore. He wasn't just a gardener either. He was something else entirely. A man who stood his ground and grew it. The end.